think by the 70s, Rod had really established himself as a star rather than simply a member of a band. I mean, he was in lots of groups prior to the 70s, like Shotgun Express, and he was in the Faces, of course. And he'd done his time, if you might call it that, playing with a band. And he always wanted to be a star, and he was going to be a star by hook or by crook.
This concert catches him at a time where he was one of the biggest stars in the world, without doubt. He'd sort of emerged to success and commercial success in the early 70s, having slogged away for a long time. He'd certainly paid his dues, you know, he played in lots of bands, sung the blues in the 60s and onwards with John Baldry and Jeff Beck and others, and then of course the Faces. But his solo career had exploded from about the early 70s when Maggie Mae gave him a big #1. By this stage, 77, he'd had several massive hits, massive album success. He'd in fact moved on to like the second phase of his solo career, where he'd become a kind of a glitterati kind of mainstream superstar on both sides of the Atlantic.
By 1977, Rod had left England and gone over to America, principally because his accountants told him that he would be paying something horrendous like 83% in the pound tax. Really heavy tax then. I don't think he particularly wanted to go, but he was urged to go. The Faces had broken up, they'd been hugely successful. And he was going solo, and Ronnie Wood was off to join the Stones. So it was a sort of an end of an era, really, for him. He went over to America and really got sucked, I think, into the Hollywood life. He had this gorgeous girlfriend, Britt Eklund, at the time. She'd just been a Bond girl in one of the Bond movies, was blonde, beautiful, didn't mind saying that she was had a healthy interest in sex.
Rod has by this time discovered Britt Eklund. Britt Eklund has discovered Rod. Rod has discovered Hollywood, and the two together are a pretty heady mix. And consequently, you have Rod Stewart superstar.
Three-Time Loser is memorable in that it's one of those people point to when they point at how Rod was over the top at this time and how his lyrics were very silly. I mean, his charm had always been that his lyrics read like a diary. There was no kind of attempt to make them, to hone them down and make them more mainstream. Three-Time Loser is a little bit dodgy in that it seems to suggest there's some kind of STD situation going on here. I couldn't swear to it, but if you listen to those lyrics, it very much suggests that Rod is writing about the perils of sleeping around and STDs, which is not a record to play your mum, really, is it?
Probably a perfect show opener because 50% of the people in the audience are still going to be at the bar. You know, they're not in their seats. They're people getting up and it's excuse me, and taking their seats. And this song that kind of nobody really cares about. It's an odd song that you can talk to 10 people about it and they won't have anything to say about it. It's like, oh yeah, I remember the title, but nobody could hum a few bars of it. And as a result of that, it's like a kind of, I think in a show like this, it's really a throat-clearing exercise.
I took a long trip to the city. She told me to get somewhere.
are some songs from this period which are not standouts at all. I mean, Wild Side of Life, Big Bayou, Three-Time Loser are not among his best ever songs.
Big Bone and Wild Side of Life, I think they are fillers in his concert set.
I think on this Melbourne show, nobody seems to be particularly interested in the Big Bayou and Wild Side of Life. I think they're filler album tracks, quite obviously, and I think they're fillers in this show as well, in as much as if you've got to have a kind of sense of build-up to the bigger numbers as the show goes on, then you've got to kind of start off with this sort of thing.
Songs like Big Bayou and Wild Side of Life to me are fillers in his stage act. They're not standout songs for me. But you know, this is the great thing about somebody like Rod Stewart. I mean, he can make a quite ordinary song sound quite special. And he's capable of taking a fairly bland and uninteresting lyric, and by focusing the attention on himself and what he's doing, he makes it interesting, because you're watching him and you're listening to that voice, and that is a wonderful voice.
Stay away from my window. Stay away from my back door too. Disconnect your telephone line. Relax, baby, and draw that line. Kick off your shoes and sit right down. And loosen up that pretty French gown. And let me pour you a good long drink. Ooh, baby, don't you hesitate, 'cause tonight's the night, yeah. It's gonna be alright, 'cause I love you, girl. Ain't nobody gonna stop us now.
Tonight's the Night is one of those sort of records which people hold up as either loving or hating about Rod. It's either an absolute stone cold Rod Stewart classic, or it's an example of everything that is wrong about him. It depends on your personal judgment.
That was a period when he really lost touch with the rock and roll side of his nature for me, and it became a little bit too much glam theatrics and not enough substance.
Tonight's the Night was an absolutely kind of typical Rod Stewart song. I mean, it sums Rod Stewart up absolutely perfectly, and his relationship with his audience, you know. If you assume that his audience is kind of 80% lads, you know, who would love to be Rod Stewart, and this idea, you know, this notion of this kind of relentless Lothario seducing some hapless virgin, and there's so many of his audience would just love to be that bloke, you know, and I'm sure they've all done it in their dreams, you know. So it just became that. It was perfect for Rod Stewart and his audience, in as much as it was the kind of the soundtrack to the life they'd like to have.
It's a half-decent song, it has to be said. You know, if there's something people don't like about it, it's the way it's overcooked, and it's too kind of like Leslie Phillips going, hello. It's that kind of, it's very lascivious and suggestive, and a little bit sort of cheesy and a little bit sexist, but at the same time it's a romp and it's funny.
Also, it was yet one more of those anthemic, i.e. sing-along Rod Stewart songs. It doesn't really matter how much you've had to drink, you can still sing the chorus to that song.
Tonight's the Night is a fine song and written by Rod, and it caused quite some controversy at the time because it was about the deflowering of a virgin, so it got a ban from the BBC and so on. And for the video, Rod enlisted Brit to come on and mumble a few seductive words at the end, which caused much merriment for a 34-year-old Brit to be considered to be the virgin in the video. wasn't exactly great casting.
One thing that's interesting in Tonight's the Night is where the camera pans to Britt Ekland in the crowd. One has to assume that this is dedicated to her and she's being serenaded. Although, to be fair, she doesn't look particularly happy in this clip. Maybe she's daydreaming, or maybe she's wondering whether she's got the shopping in for that night. But she doesn't exactly look ecstatic in the way that, oh, he's playing my song. Perhaps she'd just heard it a few hundred times by this point and the magic had worn off.
It's so hard to mind, been broke 1,000 times. Each time you break away, feel you're gone to stay. Lonely nights that come, memories that go, bringing you back again, hurting me more and more. Maybe it's my mistake to prove this love I feel inside. But I'm yours whenever you want me. You got me never knowing if I'm coming or going. I love you, yes I do. We for you. Sing the song.
If I'm asked to choose between Rod Stewart doing a blues song and Rod Stewart doing a soul song, I would choose the soul song every time.
Where Rod is particularly good around this era at covering standards is when he takes on the Motown songs and the soul songs, because the guy really did get this stuff. I mean, for all his sort of over-the-top excesses and image problems, he'd been, since the early 60s, since he could practically walk, he'd been covering, you know, R&B and soul and so forth, and, you know, loving Motown and Stax and so forth. So he generally did get this stuff. He knew how to deliver it. He knew how to phrase it. He knew when to take it down and when to bring it up. And if he was good at anything, he was good at singing soul numbers.
I like the way that he interprets some of those songs. I like it when he does Sam Cooke stuff, and when he does Marvin Gaye stuff, or when he does the Temptations or the Isley Brothers. I like it when he does those songs because he gives them a little touch of what he really is, which is a rock and roller.
So when he takes on This Old Heart of Mine, or, you know, or a Motown song in general, he really does a fine job with it.
But if you leave me 100 times, 100 times I'll have you back. 'Cause I'm yours whenever you want me. You got me never knowing if I'm coming or going. I love you, yes I do. We for you.
Once Rod's stage set had got to this size, it became difficult to interpret those songs in the way he perhaps would have liked. On this show, a real great example of this is This Old Heart of Mine. He does really well. I'm loath to say he improved on the Isley Brothers version. I don't think he did, you know, but his interpretation of it was just stunning, you know. Yet You Keep Me Hanging On was a song that wasn't right for him, and as a result it's been kind of over-amplified, and the subtleties he should have been putting in there he hasn't. So I think at this point his song selection was getting a bit questionable, but up until then I think because the bloke has such an affinity to soul music. He was able to pick songs that he would handle well and would make him sound good.
Set me free, why don't you, baby? Get out my life, why don't you, baby? You really don't want me, you just keep me hanging on. You really don't need me, child, you just keep me hanging on. You said you'd keep coming around, playing with my heart. Why don't you get out of my life and help me just to make a new start? Help me get over you the way you got over me.
The great soul singers, the great Tamla Motown period that there was very kind of engineered. It was a bit too smooth and a bit too perfect. When Rod takes those songs, he gives them a rough edge. I mean, the classic one on this set is Twisting the Night Away, which is not really a rock and roll song. I mean, what's twisting got to do with... But Rod Stewart turns it into a rock and roll song. It's a rock and roll number, and he brings the house down with it. It's a wonderful interpretation, I think. For me, it's the standout track on stage on this DVD. You can see every strength that Rod Stewart actually has going into that number.
Let me tell you about a place, summer up in New York ways, where the people are so gay, twisting the night away. Can have a lot of fun, putting trouble on the run. Man, you find your own and young, twisting the night away. Yeah. Get a fella in blue jeans who's dancing with the older queen. Cat's thrown up in a diamond ring, and twisting the night away. You know what? Man, you ought to see her go. She twisting to the rock and roll. 'Cause there ain't nothing like twisting the night away. Yes, sir.
What this show catches is how huge a star Rod was at the time, and you can see from the crowd and the reaction of the crowd here in the stadium that he was huge around the world. You know, he wasn't just huge in Britain and the States, he was huge in Australia and everywhere else. He was an icon, he was an immediately recognisable face, and you can see from this gig that the crowd just love him, and he's totally confident. You know, he's preening around like this strange cross between a camp peacock and one of the lads that, you know, was perhaps the odd thing about him. And just loving it.
It's also at a period in time where his voice was probably at its peak. He is a great entertainer, and it shows that he entertains. He's suddenly saying, okay, I am now Rod Stewart, superstar.
The worrying thing about this show is it's a small show made bigger as opposed from a big show. By the 70s, there were enormous touring bands out. You know, Sly and the Family Stone were enormous, Earth, Wind and Fire were enormous. I mean, physically enormous on the stage. Parliament Funkadelic was enormous. The Rolling Stones had built an enormous stage set. And Rod hadn't cottoned on to that one. Instead of making an enormous show that had grand things going on, grand effects going on, he'd simply taken the kind of show he could have done in a 200 capacity club and made it bigger by making it louder. And that flattens out so many of the subtleties of it. And what you're doing there, I think, at a show like that, when you've literally only got a 5-piece group on stage, nothing else, but you're probably 100 yards away from the stage at some points, it's it's the idea of Rod Stewart rather than actually Rod Stewart. He can go there, run through his catalogue, because that Melbourne show has an interesting selection of songs from across his catalogue. He's not simply pushing one album. And it's right, okay, I bought my ticket to this show, I've gone to it, I've been in the same room as Rod Stewart. You subscribe to the idea of Rod Stewart. It's very much a show for people who've already bought the albums rather than selling albums to people.
By the mid-70s, he'd rather lost that hardcore following that he had of blokish following, because the Faces were, you know, birds, booze and footy, and then music, sort of more or less in that sort of order. And then when he went over to America, and very much under Britt Ekland's influence, you could see him changing into the sort of the Hollywood glamour style. And Britt sort of put him into, you know, eyeliner on stage and very sort of flouncy outfits. And then eventually, of course, the, you know, sort of leopard skin spandex tight pants. And I think he lost the respect for the music and his own talent for a while.
He had very much been the regular guy, the bloke, you know, in a time of glam rock in the UK, he'd been the one saying, well, I stand for, you know, authenticity. The cover of his album Sing It Again, Rod, had been a pint glass, you know, a picture of a pint glass of beer. And, you know, he kicked footballs around. He was one of the lads with the Faces. He was so not the glam thing. Also, of course, now punk rock had come along. So the sort of the working class ethic was very much believing in punk rock and smashing the system and changing what was around. Whereas just at this time, Rod had gone very kind of dripping with jewellery and very kind of swanky.
Whether this was a good thing for sort of the cultural advancement of British youth or not, but I think that if you look at it realistically, it's probably a bit of Malcolm McLaren's spin.
So Rod probably unwittingly became the target of venom from punk rockers.
Bear in mind, it wasn't his fault that this should happen. I mean, he wasn't instrumental in the banning of the Sex Pistols record. So any flack that he got at the time was totally unwarranted and thoroughly undeserved.
Rod was always sort of outside looking in a bit. And as soon as he felt that they weren't moving on musically anymore, he wasn't, the challenge wasn't enough, and that they weren't going to crack America, because that's the real key for him. He wants to crack America. Then he starts to look to albums like Atlantic Crossing to do that job.
He'd made that with Tom Dowd, with the Memphis Horns, with Willie Mitchell, with two of Booker T's MGs. He really wanted to make an album that sat in the canon of soul music that he'd grown up listening to. Unfortunately, whether it was what the producers felt they were doing, what he felt he needed to be doing, what his record company felt he needed to be doing to reach this American market, it came out a bit like American FM rock, really. It wasn't the soul he was looking for had got diluted, which was a shame.
Perhaps that's the album which will stand as his testament in a way, you know, because it was kind of the midpoint between his earlier work that he'd done for years and years, in fairness, with the Faces and solo initially, the kind of authentic, gritty rock and gritty soul and R&B ballads. And then, of course, in his later career, he's been, you know, very kind of mainstream, very, very glossy and commercial and a little bit coffee table. Atlantic Crossing was perhaps the, you know, the peak after which he went down, where he still had elements of his kind of, for want of a better word, street cred roots, but he was also going global. He was going a little bit private jet and a little bit glossy.
In America, it helped to make the transition for him after leaving the Faces to, you know, a major rock star, which is what he wanted to be.
In these days, changing ways, so-called liberated days, a story comes to mind of a friend of mine. Georgie boy was gay, I guess, nothing more and nothing less. the kindest guy I ever knew. His mother's tears fell in vain. The afternoon George tried to explain that he needed love like all the rest. Pa said there must be a mistake. How can my son not be straight after all I've said and done for him? And we sang.
There's one song that called "The Killing of Georgie," which Rod wrote, which caused quite a stir at the time because it was about a friend of his, a black homosexual who was killed, and it caused a lot of fuss. That Rod should actually record something about that, and of course it raised all sorts of implications and questions about was Rod himself gay, which of course he wasn't. But as a real sort of heart-rending song, it still stands out.
The Killing of Georgie stands out in the Rod Stewart canon quite simply because it's not laddie, it's not beery, it's not... But that's if you listen to it from a lyrical point of view and you understand what it's about. It's the lyrics mean so much to people because they meant a lot to Rod when he was writing them. He was genuinely upset about his friend being killed, you know, and this was his sort of outpouring about it.
Out of a dark inside street came a New Jersey gang with just one aim, roll some innocent passerby. There he shoot a fearful fight, screams rung out in the night, George's head in a sidewalk cornerstone. A leather kid, a switchblade knife, who did not intend to take his life, pushed his luck a little too far that night. Sawed-off blood dispersed the gang, a crowd gathered, a police came, an ambulance screamed to halt, 53rd and 3rd, but we sang.
The story is very well told in kind of chapters. You know, it builds very well like a good piece of writing does. It's not just kind of, hey everyone, some of my best friends are gay. It's not just that. It is actually very well detailed. You know, even down to the sort of the streets in New York and what's going on there. And then when it closes with that couplet about youth's a mask and it doesn't last, live it long and live it fast, that's one of the great kind of payoff lines in pop lyrics, really. It's kind of pop philosophy at its very best. And this is a tremendous version we get here in the concert because he just generally gets into it. He seems to cut himself off from all the palaver for a while and he just sits down and sings it really, really well.
He said never wait or hesitate, get in kids before it's too late, cause you may never get another chance, cause youth's a mask but it don't last, live it long and live it fast. Georgie was a friend of mine, yeah. Oh, yeah.
The Killing of Georgie is a wonderful song. The problem with it is that listening to it 20 years later, it doesn't have quite the same effect. It's dated. But in the context of this DVD on stage, as a cameo of a period in time in which this song meant something because it was making a statement about the gay problems, if you like, about that period, and because it was sung with such genuine sincerity, it comes across, it works. You can see it again as a little time capsule, you know, of that period historically. You know, it's saying something worthwhile. 20 years later, I'm not so sure.
Morning sun, when it's in your face, really shows your age. That don't worry me none, in my eyes you're everything. I laughed at all of your jokes, my love you didn't need to go. Oh Maggie, I couldn't have tried anymore. You led me away from home just to save you from being a
Maggie Mae is of course the song that everybody associates with Rod Stewart, more than probably any other.
I think the track one will always associate Rod Stewart with is Maggie Mae, which came out in 1971 and was a fine single, but oddly enough, when they recorded it for the album Every Picture Tells a Story, it very nearly didn't actually make it onto the album at all. Rod played it to somebody who said, "Oh, I don't think there's much in that, not much of a melody there." So it actually got on only sort of by default when another song was needed just to complete the album, and it was released as the B-side of Rod's first of the single "Reason to Believe" by Tim Hardin. His cover version of that was the original A-side, but a DJ in Cleveland, Ohio, flipped it over and played Maggie Mae first, and it suddenly started taking off in America, and that's how it really became a hit, and eventually became a hit over here.
It was a huge #1. It came from nowhere. It was #1 for ages. It made Rod's name. It, of course, started the breakup of the Faces in a way, because they were just playing backing on Rod's solo album for fun. They were all having fun. Nobody quite realised that Rod's solo career was going to go through the roof. So Maggie Mae was initially responsible for that. Another great song with another sort of set of lyrics that a little bit strange, but very, very good, because again, they're like a diary entry. They're so confessional and so autobiographical and intimate.
Rod's reminiscence about an older woman taking his virginity at a pop festival.
Again, it's something people, if they can't actually identify with, they would like to. I'm sure, you know, most teenage boys love the idea of being seduced by an older woman, and that's what that's about.
I don't think anyone's kind of specifically said who Maggie Mae was, but Rod may have fessed up to that at some stage.
I suppose I could collect my books and get on back to school, or steal my daddy's cue, make a living out of playing pool. Let's hear ya!
The durable appeal of songs like Maggie Mae and Stay With Me is the idea everybody can join in. Really, that's still what people want. You know, there's a saying, well, they want a tune that you can whistle at a bus stop, you know. People actually wanted songs they could join in, they could feel part of, you know. It's a bit like Mick Jagger's dancing. People who couldn't dance could easily follow a few of Mick Jagger's moves and pretend to be dancing, you know. With this, you could, 2 o'clock in the morning in a disco, you know, people have had a few, they can join in singing Maggie Mae or Stay With Me, and it sounds good. They go home singing it, they buy the record, you know, it's that sort of thing. They're just songs that seep into people's conscious.
In the morning, don't say you love me, 'cause you know I'll only kick you out the door. I know your name is Rita, 'cause your perfume smells sweeter since when I saw you down on the floor. Guitar! Don't mean to sound degrading, can't feel my love is fading. A face like this, I got nothing to laugh about. Their lips say a fingernail, she already knows Jezebel. Get upstairs and read my tarot. Stay with me, 'cause tonight you're gonna stay with me.
Stay With Me was an absolute banker for Rod and the Faces at that time, written by Ron Wood and himself, and it sort of typified how the band was at the time, a real hard rocking number.
Stay With Me was probably the Faces peak. It's the one which, you know, if everyone had to pick one Faces track to take to a desert island, that would be it, because it so rocks. It features all the band individually playing completely out of their skin at their very best. And to this day, if you put it on, you know, in a club or somewhere, everyone will go completely crazy, which is all well and good.
It was also saying to the girls, look, you know, spend the night with me, but don't expect me to be around in the morning. I'll be kicking you out of the door. Basically, that's what it was saying. And it was very much, you know, the party, good time Faces.
When people say, are the Stones the best rock band in the world? No, they're not. The Faces are. That's the track that they'll dig out to prove their point.
When you saw the Faces on stage, you felt a part of that joy and that happiness that they generated from the stage. When other bands have to reinterpret that work, they don't have those qualities. They're looking to reproduce what they heard on record, not what went on stage. They can't, of course. So it quite often doesn't quite come off, like this doesn't quite come off.
This rendition of Stay With Me is one that has been over-amplified to bring it up to the size it needs to be in this auditorium, you know. It's not as subtle as it might be. Also, this bunch of session men he's got behind him, good as they are, they're not part of it like the Faces were. It's not that kind of group experience. It's very much a bloke singing in front of his band.
This band were not the Faces, that should be pointed out. You know, they were not quite the Faces. They were all individually top musicians, of course. You know, he wasn't going to just audition, you know, any old schmuck. And they're all individually top musicians, but they didn't quite perhaps have the chemistry on stage that the Faces always had, because few bands did, in fairness.
This is an example of, I suppose, of Rod Stewart's ability to pick great musicians. His problem was he could never hold on to them, because he never treated them well enough.
Georgie was a man who thought he was a loner, but he knew it couldn't last. Georgie left his home in Tucson, Arizona, for some California grass. Get back, get back, get back to where you once belonged.
Rod doing Get Back on this, it's a good choice, because it's a song that's almost impossible to mess up. I'm sure I could do Get Back and it would sound reasonably good, you know. It's just one of those songs. It's a great modern rock and roll song.
Paul McCartney was obviously a friend of his from the Beatles, and he wanted to do a Beatles cover, and that's probably the one he chose. It's a decent enough effort, I think.
I think maybe the lyric kind of meant something to him at the time too. I think he was sort of trying to get back a bit.
While she can. Get back, get back, get back to where you once belonged. Get back, get back, get back to where you once belonged.
When he does do a bad cover version, they're really bad. Get Back would be the example. It's so lazy, it's lame. It doesn't add anything at all to the original. And if you're going to do a Beatles song, you'd think you do one of the more interesting ones rather than a straightforward sort of 4/4 rock number, which I think even the Beatles would say was a bit of a sort of knocked it off in 5 minutes job. Get Back is not the most structurally interesting Beatles song, and perhaps that's why it appealed to Rod, because it was an easy pickings. But this version and the version on record have nothing special about them really at all.
When you think of Rod Stewart, you know, you can criticise the albums and possibly not like the songs that he's singing, but if you go and see him, he always does give 120%.
being praised all the time as a great singer and one of the great white soul voices, he obviously knew that he could, you know, take on a cover version and do a great job with it. There were people like Elton John calling him the greatest white soul singer in the world, the greatest soul singer in the world, bar none. Chuck Berry, famously, when he heard Rod cover a Chuck Berry song, "I can't believe that guy's white," you know, this kind of thing. He was really, really highly praised at the time. I know he's a bit of a kind of a cartoon comedy figure in a way now to some of us, but when he first emerged, the thing was, great voice, this guy's got a great voice, and that was what he was praised for.
He recorded Sailing, which was written by the Sutherland brothers, and it became a huge, huge hit. And I think at the time it was seen as a sort of anthem on the terraces, and of course the football fans did adopt it, and they were all swaying away and singing it. And then it became a big hit because he was hugely popular at the time. But it had a resurgence when it was used as the theme tune for a big BBC television documentary about the Ark Royal, which is a magnificent naval ship.
Picked up like that BBC series about the Ark Royal, and I think had a bunch of sailors singing it. I think the sailors on the ship sung it, and that kind of stirred everybody. You know, it was one of those things. The series was incredibly well watched. You know, it had viewing figures of, I think, 10 million plus. That made an enormous difference. It became almost like the Royal Navy's national anthem, really. It was the Royal Navy's theme song, and so I think with a bunch of people it almost became their patriotic duty to buy it, you know.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Through the dark night, far away, and dying, forever crying, to be near you. Who can say, can you hear me?
Sailing is one of those songs that nowadays just seems so cheesy, you can't quite believe that it was such a big hit at the time. But at the time it was the kind of the Angels by Robbie Williams of its day, or the Don't Look Back in Anger by Oasis of its day. It was just ubiquitous, it was everywhere.
The problem one has with Rod Stewart is that he can be so good, he can be so credible, he can be so believable, and then he'll sell his soul to Hollywood, and he'll do something like Sailing because he knows that it's a crowd pleaser, and he knows that it works from the stage to the audience, and the audience will join in. And it's a sing-along. It's an old sing-along song, you know, and they'll get the arms will go up and all that nonsense, you know. It's a crap song. Keith Richards sold his soul to the devil, so they say. Works quite well. Good swap, Rod has sold his soul to the bank manager. And that's not a good swap. And money to Rod is God. I mean, everybody will tell you this, of course, that has ever worked with him. You know, what comes first in his life is how much.
When you watch this concert, you can see in a way that the way inevitably he would go forward would become a little bit cabaret, a little bit Scampi and Chips, a little bit, you know, a crooner, a lounge lizard doing cover versions, which of course is where he is today in 2007.
Rod Stewart's metamorphosis as Frank Sinatra is really something that I find distasteful. It's yet again another indication of how Rod will do almost anything for money.
It's interesting where Rod is now. He's tagged as this kind of cabaret crooner, and in almost a derogatory way. And there's sort of nothing wrong with cabaret crooning, really. You know, Dean Martin made a good living out of it, and I think at Rod's time of life, this is sort of what he ought to be doing. There's something a bit kind of wrong with the notion of, you know, as a bloke who's hurtling towards his 70s, putting on disco trousers and giving it plenty on stage at Wembley Arena. Whereas with this, I think he can go back to showing actually what a good singer he is.
He's still a decent singer, maybe not as great as he was since the throat operation, you know, but, you know, all sympathy to him for that. You know, he's done well to come back at all. It's kind of a lazy little comfortable niche he's found for himself now.
Rod Stewart is actually a rock and roll tart. He's a strumpet, you know. He'll sell himself for almost any concoction that will actually enhance his fame and make him more money. God knows why he never did a punk album. He must have, perhaps it never made enough money in America.
Clearly the bloke doesn't want to give up singing or music, and there's no reason why he should, but at the same time he's found something that fits where he is in life now.
One has to judge him on someone who's the longevity of his career you can't knock. You can knock certain parts of it, but to sustain that popularity and still be able to sell out the Albert Hall, for example, 40 years after he's first started out.
He has, perhaps first and foremost, always had this fantastic voice, which no matter how much you doubted him, how much you thought he was a bit of a joke, how much he sold out and went a bit rubbish, you'd hear the records and hear him singing live, and you'd always think, my God, that guy can sing.